All right, guys. My name is Brian Nguyen, and this is going to be the longer video of the honor senior thesis for my project. As you guys can see, my topic is in regards to Native American burial rights. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, a bit of background on myself. My name is Brian Nguyen, and my major is economics in the Levy School of Business. And a bit of reasoning behind why I chose this particular topic was because of a bit of literature that I read from my Culture and Ideas course that I took during my freshman year. And a bit more of why I also wanted to choose this topic was also a bit of the history that I learned from my archaeology course that I took over the summer for my science requirement. And in a way, I think this thesis is very important for us, especially for those living in California. And given that Santa Clara is literally a mission that has history with this issue, I think it's incredibly important that we have knowledge about this particular topic. So, a bit of introduction of the thesis before I actually introduce my thesis. The main issue at hand is there's currently a present day conflict over burial rights, and a lot of scientists and some archaeologists want to learn more from the remains that are discovered currently and in the past as well. But some of these remains are attributed to native tribes who wish for their remains to be reburied in the proper location and through the tribe's ritual. In doing so, there's a conflict between those who want to use the remains for research and science versus those that want to respect those remains. And in doing so, this ongoing conflict has led me to my thesis, which is that the analysis of Native American history, specifically the Ohlone and Miwok tribes, before and post colonization, with the addition of present day policies, will help demonstrate the shifts that had occurred in Native culture and livelihood. In doing so, this thesis intends to emphasize the importance of the ongoing struggle to restore and respect Native customs, as seen in the current conflict over the burial rights of Native ancestry. And this conflict is the before mentioned conflict regarding the issue of wanting to use the remains for research and science versus wanting to rebury them for the respect of the Native tribes. So let's go over the methodology behind this research project. Essentially, what this paper does is that it goes through a reverse timeline. So instead of going all the way back to the native history, the Ohlone and the Miwok's history, and then working forward to present day, we're going to start with the present day and then work backwards. And as you guys can see from the breakdown of it, it starts with the introduction, then we move on to the post colonization or the modern day policies. And then we're going to move on to the period of colonization that occurred with the Spanish settlers and the mission systems. Then we're going to move back to the pre colonization era, where that's when the true culture really flourished between the Miwok and the Ohlone. And the reason behind this idea to have a reverse timeline is to essentially bring light on the rich culture that was lost from the atrocities of the mission systems and why the Ohlone and the Miwok should have the burial rights to respect and restore the remains that are discovered currently. So a bit of my results and findings, I'll just go through each of the sections that I did and a bit of the key important parts for each of the sections. For the post-colonization or the modern day policies, a couple things to note is that the Miwok is federally recognized, but the Ohlone is still in the process currently to be federally recognized. The Native American Grave Protection Act was established by the United States in 1990 as a sort of way to offer reparations to the Native Americans. However, there are issues with this act, as there's that whole issue with the burden of proof and how the Native tribes need to provide proof that they have lineage to the remains. And in doing so, this has led to a lot of skeletal remains being in museums, and that still to this day have not been attributed to the native tribes. And one of the biggest case studies that we go over in this section was the Kennewick Man example, which is one of the biggest conflict of research versus respect that has happened in the modern era, where a lot of the researchers wanted to use the remains found in Washington to learn more about the history of the land, but a native tribe that had lineage to those remains wanted to respect the past and the ancestries by reburying it. So there was an ongoing legality battle there that occurred, and thankfully, the natives to this day have been able to regain and rebury the remains of the Kennewick man. And lastly, in this section, it talks about the legacy of the mission system, which has displaced these remains and why these native tribes ought to have the right for the burial remains of the of the remains discovered. And then we move on to a bit of colonization era where we talk about these Spanish expeditions who was primarily set out to California for forts and missions. One of the biggest examples that involved the Ohlone and the Miwok was Mission Dolores in San Francisco, in which the settlers felt they had a responsibility, quote unquote, to convert the natives. And this introduced a lot of forced labor and a lot of conversion from their beliefs to Christianity. And in doing so, one of the biggest legacies is that it robs the Ohlone and the Miwoks of their culture, which goes in bit into that in the pre-colonization period, where many subgroups had existed in the Miwok and the Ohlone tribes, and they had a lot of lifestyles prior to the mission system, whether it's gathering food or whether it's uh, ceremonies or rituals that involve dances and stuff for their death and burials. And a lot of this was taken away from them when they were placed into these mission systems that the Spanish settlers established. So ultimately, by demonstrating the current day policies and how ineffective they currently are, by demonstrating the atrocities that the mission systems had on the natives, and by showing the cultures that was lost because of the mission system, I hope to have identified the reasoning behind why the United States government ought to improve their reparations to the natives by giving them further burial rights over the discovered remains right now. Thank you.